The debate over paying college athletes has reached a tipping point in recent weeks. Last month, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law a bill that allows California student athletes to profit from their likeness, meaning they could sign advertising contracts currently prohibited by NCAA rules. A similar bill has been introduced in the Florida legislature, and New York State House, which is considering a bill that could make the state's universities pay their athletes directly.
But opponents believe the new California law and other proposed legislation could mean the end of college sports as we know it. Joining us now via Skype to discuss all of this and more is Michael McCann. He's the legal analyst for Sports Illustrated and the director of sports and entertainment law at the University of New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce School of Law. Great to have you, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Just give us some of the background here. Like, what is the current structure and what is being proposed?
Sure. So the current structure is that college athletes cannot license their name, image, and likeness, for instance, for use in video games, for apparel, for getting an endorsement deal, for sponsoring a camp. That's not permitted under NCAA rules. And if a player were to do that, he or she would lose their eligibility. What these legal efforts are trying to do is to tell colleges, you can no longer enforce those rules, that the state law would be set up so that these players would have a right to hire an agent, to negotiate contracts for apparel, video games, sponsoring a camp, things like that. So that's sort of the gist of it.
Michael, I mean, the NCAA has fought these things so vociferously. And why is that? Is it, I mean, frankly, I'm from College Station, Texas. I watched that school print money off of their student athletes to the tunes of, hundreds of millions of dollars. Is it simply that they don't want to split the pie and give leverage to the college athletes? Or is there an actual institutional argument against this?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask.
Right.
There's a stated institutional argument, which is that amateurism, this concept that college athletes are amateurs, and that the NCAA needs to impose bright line rules that clearly distinguish college athletes as students versus professional athletes, that this type of restriction on them and their earning power is consistent with that goal. Though many don't believe that. Many have noted that just even the phrase student athlete was developed as a litigation device in workers' comp cases about 50 years ago. And then secondarily, as you noted, the idea that these athletes are generating quite a bit of revenue, particularly really their identity rights, their name, image, and likeness, that these types of bills in most cases don't require colleges to pay anything. It's about the athlete and the relationship with third parties. And it isn't just football players and men's basketball players. There are women athletes might benefit as well. Really, you could argue the athletes who would benefit the most are those that won't go on and play pro sports, that don't get to go to the NBA or NFL.
That's
Right.
actually a great point that I hadn't thought of. Who is profiting off of them now?
Well, right now their profits are, you could argue, inured by the companies themselves because they're not having to pay the athlete for his or her name, image, and likeness. And then secondarily, you could argue that the colleges and the conferences and the NCAA are not having to share the pot to the extent that that money would be divided among all these different groups, be it the players, colleges, conferences, NCAA, and the companies with which they do business. If the players are excluded from that, everyone else gains a little bit more.
Yeah. Michael, I also wanted to ask you about the situation with the NBA and the Hong Kong and China fallout. You recently wrote a column about how it could lead to legal disputes. What legal disputes are we talking about here?
Well, if the Chinese companies with whom the NBA has done business sever contracts with the NBA, there could be potential breach of contract claims. Those, I suspect, would be remedied, or rather litigated through arbitration or mediation. But this could become messy, especially because enforcing a judgment in a U.S. court in China is very difficult. So for the NBA, this is, beyond just the public relations, beyond the political pressure from both parties. This also has potential legal consequences. And of course, the NBA is so heavily invested in China that the amount of money that they would be walking away from, money that they probably projected, and also money that's shared evenly with players, more or less, this could certainly have an impact.
Have we ever seen an analogous situation where a foreign country is exerting such influence over even what, Americans can say?
Yeah, I can't recall one. I think some of the Olympic Games over the years have had controversies in terms of where they're hosting. whether a country is willing to. We remember the Cold War. This came up in terms of athletes' speech and participation in games, but nothing to this scale, and nothing with respect to a professional league. That this is really a unique thing. And there have been some arguments between Japanese baseball leagues and Major League Baseball over transfer of players breaching their contract in Major League Baseball to go play in Japan or vice versa. But again, nothing to this scale or magnitude.
Michael, it's interesting. You know, we talk about politics all day on this show, but I have noticed an extraordinary discomfort from people who work in the sports world, ESPN, and many of these other companies to cover this Hong Kong and China issue. Why do you think that is? As somebody who comes from that world, can you explain it to us?
I think there's unfamiliarity with the facts, and that would be a key thing, right? That these journalists and leagues and players and coaches, that they really just, they know the headlines, but they may not know the story, and they may not know, the origin of the debate. They may not know the exact relationship between Hong Kong and China, one country, two systems, and they're worried that what they say could have significant fallout. They saw that a tweet led to a pretty massive reaction, and I think they're mindful that they don't want to enter the fray and maybe make things worse.
And it's strange, though, because they enter the political fray all the time. I mean, the NBA is famous for being one of the wokest leagues, right? I mean, they literally boycotted an American state for its, for a bathroom bill. But it seems that when they have enormous financial interest, they're very not, they become extremely quiet very quickly. And I wonder if there's any grappling with that within the sports world right now.
Yeah, I think there's some cognitive dissonance there. There's no question about it. I do think that the athletes would argue that when they've been political, it's been in issues that to them have had clear policy positions where, in other words, you mentioned the bathroom bill in North Carolina.
Right.
There was broad support, not only in the NBA, but really, I think many would say, in a variety of states and groups in the country against it. And then with other topics, for instance, when Donald Sterling, the owner of the Clippers, made racist comments, that the players spoke out against it. I mean, those you could argue were a little bit more clear cut, where they sort of understood the issue, they understood the stakes, and really the consequences for speaking out maybe weren't that significant. Here, right? I mean, this is a different story. This is involving a foreign matter where, we know that American businesses have done business in China for decades. I mean, there are major brands that have been there, and that they haven't been scrutinized as the NBA has been over the last week. So I'm sure that this is sort of catching everyone a little bit off guard. But you're right. I mean, there is, if they're willing to talk about these other things, if you're entering the political fray, you kind of make yourself vulnerable to talk about all political stuff.
Yeah.
Yep, it's a real reckoning, and the almighty dollar reigns supreme. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate you joining us. Next on Rising, Senator Bernie Sanders maintains his stronghold of young voter support in the latest College Pulse poll.
Friend of the show, Tarrant Klein, is going to break down the results with us next.